Chapter 8. During one of Mr. Gurdjieff's many visits to America, I remember that he spent a great deal of time going to the movies. He said that one great difficulty for him in the Western world was that being of a basically Oriental temperament and nature, it was often hard for him to comprehend the underlying Western mentality. He said that while most Westerners would assert that the movies were an exaggerated conception of American life and did not present a true picture of America, he disagreed. He did agree that the active physical behavior represented in the movies was exaggerated. However, he claimed that the underlying motives and the hopes, dreams, and desires of Americans in general were very accurately portrayed in films. In fact, he said that only in the movies was the prevalent American attitude towards sex, for example, revealed for what it really was. He went on to say that his statements could not, in any case, be challenged because the mentality of movie producers was obviously such that they could not invent anything, but could only copy and occasionally distort life, which is, according to him, exactly what they did. When he expanded on the subject of sex, in or out of the movies, he said that it was perfectly obvious that while the function of sex had originally only been to ensure the reproduction and continuation of the human race, it had become something very different since it had been civilized in America and elsewhere in the Western world. He said that sex, being basically the source of all energy and therefore potentiality, the wellspring, for example, of art, had also become for most people nothing more than the most titillating diversion of the many forms of amusement known to modern man, because of this energy that could be used, and was destined to be used for a serious and high purpose, was simply wasted, thrown away in a frantic chase after pleasure. While he did not specifically condemn this activity any more than he condemned other ordinary civilized habits, he criticized it from the point of view that any waste is improper to man. He suggested that human needs generally had not been subject to the same kind of perversion as in the case of sex. The drives to eat, to eliminate waste matter from the body, to sleep, etc., were in their own ways equally strong. In fact, if a given individual had a sufficiently strong need to go to the bathroom or was dying of thirst or hunger, no amount of sexual provocation could possibly come before any one of these needs. The pleasure involved in drinking water when really thirsty was, of course, different from the gratification of a sexual need, but equally compelling. He pointed out that this perversion of sex was a question that could be profitably studied and examined by everyone, and that any diversion of the sexual impulse into more creative channels than sheer satisfaction could be a worthwhile task for anyone. When people questioned him, as they often did, about specific sexual perversion, he waved away their questions as hair-splitting. Perversion was perversion, no matter what particular form it might take. There was no question of good perversion or bad perversion. Sex generally was perverted when it served to perform anything other than the basic intentions of nature, to produce children and to produce energy which was to be used for higher aims, certainly than merely physical or emotional gratification. When improperly used, such energy was always harmful. Gurdjieff frequently used sex as a kind of shock factor in dealing with individuals. I remember the case of one young woman, a dancer whose principal attraction to Gurdjieff's work was that she was allowed to teach his dances to newcomers because she was a good dancer and a reasonably good teacher. Her interest in his work did not, however, seem to go beyond this pleasure in having a position of some authority. When she once challenged some statement he had made during the course of a lecture, he told her that he would have to give her a personal answer to the questions she was raising and would arrange for someone to give her a definite appointment to see him alone. That night after the lecture, he told me to go to her and invite her to come to his room at 3 o'clock in the morning alone. He also told me to tell her that he would show her some wonderful things that she could not even imagine. When I gave her the message, she listened scornfully and with a show of good deal of righteous shock and anger told me to tell him that she recognized a proposition when she heard one, and that not only would she not come to his room, but that she would no longer have anything to do with his work. He was very amused when I relayed this reply to him, and said that she had made an unfortunate for her, but good for him, choice. He said that her preoccupation with sex was such that she was no longer a good teacher of his dances, and that he had chosen this means, face-saving for her, of dismissing her as a teacher. He added, however, that there were times when he was not above diverting himself in the current American fashion, and that they might both have been rewarded had she agreed to visit him. Then he went on to say that it was just as well, since he did not really have the time to deal with the reverberations that would undoubtedly have followed had she accepted his proposition. He also said that her refusal would serve her as a topic of conversation and imaginative thought for the rest of her life. On the one hand, she could say that she had rejected the great Gurdjieff's advances, and on the other hand, she could spend her life wondering what it would have been like had she accepted. I remember the reaction of one female group member on learning from the dancer herself, of course, who lost no time in spreading the story of the incident. With a pained look on her face, she said to me, "If it had only been me, what an opportunity! Can't you get me an appointment?" I suggested that she might approach him directly and let him know of her availability, but again, sadly, she had to admit that she didn't have the nerve. It also seemed to amuse Gurdjieff to describe, always in accurate detail, the sex lives or the sexual history of some of the people who came to him for advice. He said that since sex by its nature only permitted of a rather limited repertory, it was simple to deduce the particular forms of satisfaction which were attractive to certain natures or temperaments. The descriptions were invariably vulgar and often amusing. I have heard a great many stories and a great deal of gossip about Gurdjieff's own repudiated sexual practices, most of which were obviously untrue and seemed to stem from the fact that anyone who had set himself up as a leader, or who has a school of an unusual nature, must also more or less automatically have an unusual and varied sex life. The only somewhat unusual truth about this aspect of his life that I know to be a fact is that he did have children by a few different women in whom he was not married, a normal if not legal performance, and a far cry from the practices, rites, and orgies which I have heard ascribed to him. Even now, many years after his death, I find it is not uncommon for people who know of him by reputation to inquire about his sexual practices, often suggesting that they must have been not only very interesting and unusual, and incidentally that I had certainly either participated in them or at least knew all about them, but even a part of his teaching. They are always disappointed, one might say even disillusioned, to learn the opposite, particularly to learn that he was married, reacting almost as if that was the final sin for anyone of his peculiar stature.